Hi, I'm Sunny from Sonlight Curriculum, and I'm excited to tell you about the segment you're going to hear next. Sarita Holtzman, the president of Sonlight, founded this company more than 30 years ago as the original literature-based homeschool curriculum. Many families who start homeschooling with Sonlight do so because they love to read, myself included. And if you're anything like I am, you love to get new TBR or to-be-read book recommendations from people you trust. So who better to get suggestions from than Sarita herself? She reads hundreds of books a year and reviews them for inclusion in Sonlight's programs. And in this episode, she's going to tell you about two books, one that is already part of a Sonlight program and one that's not. You'll get to hear what the books are about, why she thinks they're important, who she recommends them for, and more. So please join us. Sunny and Sarita here to talk about two more books. Sarita, thank you for bringing your recommendations to our audience. So many of us chose to homeschool with Sonlight because we love to read. So it is a real privilege to get these suggestions from you. And the first book we're talking about today is Rules of the Road. This one is by Joan Bauer, and it's part of Sonlight's Level 100, which is our high school American history program. My daughter's actually doing this level right now, but we haven't read it yet. So I'm excited to hear more about it and what makes this book special.
Well, I think most of us have books that we would consider comfort books, right? Books that you go back to when you just need a good book to read and you've read it before. So this is actually one of those for me. I love the main character. Her name is Jenna, and she's just a real strong character who's coming through just some tough times, but she manages to overcome. And that's kind of my favorite. But if you can get a theme like that, that's probably my favorite, right? Now, she has an alcoholic father who steps in and out of her life, and just kind of when he steps in, her life just goes into turmoil, mainly because she tries to protect her younger sister and she tries to cover for him. So she's got this dilemma where he steps into her where she works and she has to try to figure out how to get him out. And not anyway, she just takes a lot of responsibility. She's an oldest child, and it makes sense that she's that way. She has a very supportive mom who ended up divorcing her dad because of his alcoholism and the trouble that brought to the family. But she has a wonderful grandmother who is currently wrestling with Alzheimer's. So you have lots of big themes and big troubles and things that are happening in her life, and how she navigates life through all of these situations and how she learns and grows is just marvelous. It's also a business book. She works for a shoe company, and she talks about why she's such a successful salesperson. And it's basically because she finds out what the customer needs and makes sure that gets the best product that can get. And she's done the training and she understands how the foot works. And anyway, it's quite charming in that way. And she'll talk about how a good store should be set up and how she can really care for customers. And I think actually that's good lessons for our students to observe as well. And she learns how to stand up for what's right. And that's kind of the theme of the entire book. She meets a shoe salesman in another store. It's basically the story of a journey. She takes the owner of the shoe business, the bigger company, to a strategic board meeting. So she serves as the driver for this woman, and then they visit different shoe stores along the way. So you get to compare and contrast, this shoe store does this well, this one's really not doing very well. And she ends up meeting probably the best shoe salesman in the world. And he ends up being a recovering alcoholic. So you have the contrast of her dad, who denies the fact that he is an alcoholic, compared to this man who has gone through Alcoholics Anonymous and has helped transform the lives of many alcoholics who come, and he mentors and cares and helps them get through that. And the contrast of a well-lived life to a life that's just basically kind of thrown away, because her dad is a great salesman himself. He had so much potential, but because of his alcoholism, he can't hold a job. He can't. So it's the contrast and the picture between those two. Basically, she helps the owner of the shoe store come up against the board, and they overcome. And it's just a great story of figuring out who you are, what you shine in, getting a voice, speaking up, all kinds of messages I just adore in a story.
Yeah, definitely sounds inspiring too, like those movies that you watch that, you're
Yeah.
just like, wow, now I want to go do something differently. And when I looked through it, I noticed a lot of dialogue between the main characters, shorter chapters, it's easy to read. You
Mm.
describe it as a comfort book. And so at first glance, I feel like this would be a good one for even the most hesitant readers. But it does tackle those tough issues, like you mentioned, her alcoholic father. Is there anything that listeners maybe should be aware of before they dive right in, as far as tough topics or anything like that?
Well, if you're dealing with death, one of the man who overcame his alcoholism actually is killed by a drunk driver. So that does happen in the book,
Mhm.
and it's the grieving and the hard time. So that would potentially be it's a reality, I think, for a lot of people. So to deal with death probably is a good thing. But again, it's a picture of a well-lived life where people come and celebrate his life compared to her dad, who's just, nobody even wants to spend any time with him. Very, very sad. We just know that living rightly brings good lives, right? So anyway, but it's a good story. It's a good question.
And I also noticed when I picked it up, it's won several awards, as many of our Sonlight books have. How much does that weigh into your decision when you include a book in a Sonlight program? Is that something that you look for initially, or do you, read it first and then decide after reading the story whether it's worthy of that award or not? How does that work?
Um, I request all of the award winners just because I feel like that's a good place to start. It's been very interesting to see, back up a little bit, when I originally selected all the little readers we put in second grade, right, all the beginning readers, I ended up getting what they call an annotated catalog after the fact, right? I put them all in, built the whole program, and then went through the annotated catalog and found that every one of the titles I had chosen was a major award winner, right? It was one of those where, well, that one won. Oh. So I don't think I go purposefully looking for them, but I'm not surprised when I pick a book that is an award winner.
Well, that's very cool. Yeah, to see that. Because, I think a lot of times people see, oh, it's another Newbery Award winner. It's another this, that. And finding out how you select those and that you just agree with the assessment. Our next book has a very long title, so I'm going to try not to mess it up, but it's not currently part of a Sonlight program. This is just one of your recommendations, and that is His Kingdom Come, an integrated approach to discipling the nations and fulfilling the Great Commission. And this one comes from YWAM, which is Youth with a Mission, for those who are unfamiliar. But before we dive into this particular book, can you tell us a little bit more about how Sonlight includes missionary books in our programs and why we emphasize missions in our curriculum?
It comes from our focus on having a bigger world picture, right? As opposed to, I think we live in a broader world and we need to be aware of what's happening around us. We tend to be a lot of curriculum tends to be more insular, really, really focused, navel gazing almost at the States. But I feel like we live in a broad world and it's good for us. We'll be working with people from around the world. It's good for us to be able to read the papers and understand the news. So just having a bigger world view, I feel, is super, super important. So missionary biographies are, again, just trying to raise up heroes. This is not one of those. This is, I get a lot of samples, and I'm basically trying to read through them alphabetically. They're all arranged alphabetically by author. And when I first picked this one up, I actually didn't even want to read it. It's not a very attractive cover. I kind of went, oh, I don't know. But after I did, I'm really, really grateful. It's basically a collection of essays that try to explain how to impact the world to bring about Jesus's kingdom, right? As a believer, I've been a believer all my life. I don't remember ever not loving Jesus. And a churchgoer all my life too. It's like whenever there's doors open, we go. But it was so interesting to me to think through. I didn't hear a lot of sermons on how do we bring the kingdom to earth. I think most of us go to church and we hear, the gospel, there's good news, let's transform our lives and let's look forward to going to heaven. But the message of this book is that we need to bring God's kingdom now, right? If we hear the Lord's Prayer, thy kingdom come, right? It's not, how do we bring his kingdom to earth at this point in time? It's an opportunity that we have as believers, and it was it was very, very eye-opening for me to read. I think they talk about in the introduction that there's key spheres of influence, and the 7 mountains is kind of a modern thing they talk about. And those are education, the church, arts and entertainment, media, family, government, and business. So how do we influence as believers these key arenas, these key areas where we have an opportunity to transform them with things from the gospel, right? The book opens with a section on kind of the biblical background for it. Why should we? and this is kind of their theme and their idea. And the first chapter in that section, I just about took my head off. It just about blew me away. It's written by a lady named Landa Cope. And she was listening to a journalist, investigative journalist, who did a comparison between 2 cities. He took what he considered was the most Christian city in the world, based on number of churches, number of believers, number of baptized people, whatever numbers he used. And then he compared the data with just a regular city, right? And it turned out that there was no difference in, like, for example, fewer divorces, less crime, better test scores. And he went through the whole list of all the things that weren't changed as a result. And she just was sitting on the couch going, all my life, I've been told that the gospel should make a difference. It should change, right? It should change society. And it's not. So how do we do that, right? Anyway, she's out driving somewhere and was listening to the Bible on tape and went, wait, what? And she was listening to Exodus. And she kind of stopped and listened to it again. And she said, oh, that passage is dealing with government. Listened a little more. Oh, that's talking about economics, right? So it was one of those where, as she thought about it, she thought, when the people of Israel came out of Egypt, they had been slaves for 400 years. At that point, they had nothing, right? They had, she had a whole list. She said they were poor, they had no land, they had no schools, right? No school system, you wouldn't have. They had no army, no government, right? If you were a slave, the Pharaoh was over everything that you had done. They had no industry, no economy, no religious system. They had a welfare mentality, right? They had been fed everything, given whatever they needed, right? Basically, and with no work ethic, and they had no developed social system. So basically, the Old Testament is God's way to bring this group of slaves and transform them through the things that he sets up. So basically it's so she bought a Bible and then she started marking it up, right? So she did, I think, green for economy. Anytime she'd find something economic, she'd highlight that verse in green, and maybe government was purple, or so she color coded her Bible and could say, God gives us directions on how to transform the society. And it worked. If you think about it, within, was it 300 years, you get to David, and people would come from around the world to see the beautiful city of Jerusalem. The standard of living had, Queen of Sheba came to Solomon and went, she was awestruck. So you come from slavery and a system that had nothing and transformed it because of God's rules and laws and directions on how to do that all. Super compelling and super interesting. And I thought, I actually have never read the Bible from that particular perspective. I'm thinking that and maybe I need to.
Yeah. Well, and I love a book like that makes you think. Yeah. And I know, yeah, when I started color coding in my own Bible, that things that you didn't see initially, they do kind of come to light that way. So yeah, that's really fascinating. And I'm sorry, did I cut you off? Were you gonna say something? No. Okay.
Basically, and then they have a chapter on the New Testament, and they compare the Great Commission done in Mark, which he would say, Mark says, go preach to individuals. And he compares that to Matthew, which is go teach nations, which again would be, how do we bring the kingdom to the nations of this earth? The third part is different historical examples. They talk about Calvin and Geneva and how the city was transformed and built to be, kind of a Christian city, and how that worked and how that operated. They give an example of what happened in Fiji, which I found very interesting. And they had other ones, for example. And then part 4 is the philosophy of ministry. The whole book was just mind-bending, and I can't go into all of it because it's about 500 pages. But they give examples of what happened in Albania, where they had principles and practices that they did. So it's an example of how they've modeled and how they've done the different things. And then the last section is strategy. And they talk about different ways that they've impacted these key arenas that they talked about, the church and the family and the government. And then there's a chapter where different people have attempted to bring the ministry of God to these different arenas in different countries around the world. If you're at all interested in thinking of moving overseas, trying to make a difference in the world, this could be a useful tool to pick up. So.
Well, and that answers my next question. I was going to ask who you would recommend it to. You said it's long and the cover is not appealing. You know, of course, I love that even Sarita judges a book by its cover sometimes, but that there's so much useful information in there. So yeah, do you think, I mean, do you have to be somebody who's thinking about missions and oversee? You mentioned at the end kind of practical applications for how you can apply what you've learned in there. Is there anybody else that might benefit from reading it, even if they're not, you know, moving overseas, or, you know, how can they impact, you know, their sphere of influence, I guess, in the world that they live in? Is it still beneficial for them?
I think it could be useful for everyone. It was one of those where I originally thought about putting it in, but I thought, oh, it's probably too specific for a high school program. I might change my mind on that if I get a lot of people that say, oh my goodness, this was amazing. But I think we all need to be thinking through, what sphere do we want to impact? How do we help change the world? One of the premises of the book is, you know, there's millions of believers. If each one of us took a small area and said, what impact? How can I bring change? How can I bring a new thinking to this whole arena? How much good could we bring to this world? So honestly, it's probably for everybody. I found it interesting because where I live, but it's one of those where I think all of us need to be thinking through, how do we bring transformation? How do we bring Christ's kingdom here on earth?
Yeah, I love that. That is great. Is there anything else you'd like to add about either of these books? Yeah, definitely so much information you shared. Again, you know, I think it's given us a lot to think about and a lot to encourage us to read it, even if a book looks long or maybe a little intimidating, that there's still some value in there. And so thank you so much for sharing with them. I know every time I talk to you and we discuss these suggestions, my to be read list keeps growing. And so I love to hear what you have to say, and I'm sure our listeners do as well. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Sonny. Appreciate what you do.